oh, I did the whole thing where I started and then it started. So let's get started. Right, this video is sort of a spontaneous one that I'm making. It doesn't really fit into any particular show, but it includes statistics about patterns of belief in the UK and in England in particular. And I thought it was really interesting, and so kind of like I did with the Bush campaign strategy, I thought I would go ahead and share this with you guys. So as in the previous video, you're mostly going to be looking at slides and I'm going to be talking over it. And I've gone through it once already, and so I can tell you that it's basically descriptive statistics. We're not going to be doing anything inferential or model testing or looking at coefficients, statistical significance, size, strength, or anything like that. So it'll be pretty straightforward, and therefore it's sort of interesting, but it's not that insightful. But it is useful to see where the country is and where the UK is generally, where England is, because that was a focus of this. So let's get started by looking at some data. And just like last time, I'm going to do this screen share thing. I'm going to share my entire screen, just talking myself through the process here. Right, present to everybody. And hold on. There we go. Right, so here is the slides that I want to show you, and it looks like it's working just fine. So no, that's, sorry, wrong one. No, I don't want that either. Ah, techno fear. It's happening again. All right, there we go. All right, I won't touch anything else now. This research was done by the Barna group, and I don't really know, I know that the Barna group has done studies using religious data before. And I don't know much about their organization. You can see here from the lower left-hand corner that this research was probably funded by the Church of England, the Evangelical Alliance, and whatever Hope is in the UK. But when I look at the data, it doesn't look wonky. It doesn't look different from other data I've seen, let's say using the British Social Attitudes Survey or other British data. So I'm just going to kind of put it out there that, you know, this study seems sort of on its face to be done in a way that's methodologically sound, even though it's funded by groups that have an interest in the data, obviously. And I think that what they do is, in their presentation, they spend more time dealing with the kinds of questions that Christians would want to know than we as atheists might want to know. But I still think it's worth having a look at this to examine where England is, because that's where they mostly focus on. And that's a kind of an interesting point of comparison for other countries. So their study overview, they wanted to know what UK adults knew and believed about Jesus, what they thought of his followers, Christians, if they talked to Christians about faith in Jesus, and how do Christians and non-Christians feel about those conversations. Here is their methodology. It's a bespoke online survey, which means that they kind of picked it out from a larger panel using nationally representative sample with oversampling of 1,621 UK practicing Christians. They needed to oversample the practicing Christians because there are so few of them that if you just left it to the randomness of a sampling frame, you probably wouldn't get enough to say anything without a margin of error of 10%. So they've gone ahead and oversampled on UK practicing Christians to better understand that community. That's fine as long as we understand that in terms of how the sample is weighted so it doesn't skew the results. This is data from July of 2015, and the national data themselves are weighted to be representative, very similar to like what the census looks like. And the sampling error on the national data is plus or minus 1.8 percentage points. So that's very low margin of error. And on the oversample data, the margin of error is slightly larger. It's at 2.4%. I understand this slide to be telling us a little bit about who is in the English sample and their distributions by age. And this slide shows again, this is for the English, defining the English audience. So I assume this means that they're talking about England, but they have in here self-identified Christians who say that Christianity best describes their religious faith, and non-Christians, and that's basically everybody else. Within that category of Christian, they break it out into practicing Christians, and practicing Christians are people who report praying, reading the Bible, and attending church at least once a month. The rest of the people are considered non-practicing Christians. And if you look at this distribution, then the previous slide looked kind of big, 57 to 43%. But as you can see, when you actually separate out what might be called cultural Christians from practicing Christians in the sample, and it's very generalizable to the wider population, are only 9% of all of the total of the Christians themselves, whereas 48% don't meet that threshold of praying, reading the Bible, and attending church service at least once a month. And that to me shows how incredibly secular the UK is. Even when people are identifying as Christians, it tends to be more of a cultural Christianity than a day-to-day faithful practice. And as this chart shows, the English practicing Christians are disproportionately older. Almost 30% of them are over the age of 65 or 65 or older. More than, I'm getting on a 50%, 49% are over the age of 45. So you can see this is definitely a cohort effect, with younger English residents being less likely to be practicing Christians. Now this slide compares the distribution of people in the group, the total population, versus practicing Christians as a percent of the total population. And you can see all of these run somewhere under 3%. I mean, it's basically 2% of people in that age group are practicing Christians. If it's 18 to 24, 25 to 34, we're talking really small percentage of the total population that are Christians that meet the definition of practicing Christians, including church service, praying, and reading the Bible. In the next few slides, what they do is just compare all English adults to English practicing Christians, and I'm not entirely sure why this is useful. I mean, it's certainly a nice filler, but insofar as how you're going to change your message or understand where your base comes from, I don't know why they put this in here. Similar thing with the career. I don't know, what we're supposed to take away from this meaningfully, so I'll just skip over it. We're going to now look at what the survey reported in terms of people's attitudes, or about their beliefs, I should say, about Jesus. According to this, 2 in 5 English adults believe the Bible is God's word. So you've got the Bible is the actual or inspired word of God, and then you've got the Bible is not inspired by God, but tells people, tells about how people understood the world or whatever else. And that, you can see, makes up a bigger percentage if you add those together than the people who actually think the Bible was the inspired word of God. In terms of an historical Jesus being a real person, you can see here that about 60% of the age categories, all English, and then the younger categories also think that Jesus was a person in history. There's about 20 to 25% who think that he's fictional or mythical, and a similar, not too dissimilar number, 18%, said that they don't know. This is comparing the rates of belief based on ethnicity. And one of the things that becomes, I guess, more clear as the slides go on is that there is a division between sort of white British and and then ethnic minority, Black ethnic minority, BME voters or popular, believers or candidates. That there is a difference you can see here of about 19%, 20% in terms of believing that Jesus really lived or was a historical person. And we're going to see that it's the non-white community that actually has a larger percentage of what we would consider more traditional practicing Christians than the white British community. And again, this is the human form. We're just going to move on. sorry, I'm just going to go back really quick here. So yes, 1 in 5 English adults believe Jesus was God in human form who lived among people. That's, yeah, not very many. Whereas more people here are, English adults are more likely to believe Jesus was a prophet or some kind of spiritual leader rather than God. And you've got here are the distributions, God in human form with slightly higher ethnic minority belief. And this is all English adults, so this isn't just Christians, so this could include a lot of other categories here. Normal human being, and then spiritual, not God. A spiritual leader, but not a God. So pretty low levels of what we would consider kind of classic orthodox, I guess is the right word I'm looking for here, Christian beliefs. 21% of all English adults, 21% of white English adults, and 25% of ethnic minority English adults. In terms of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, this headline is slightly misleading. The classic one, I believe the resurrection, word for word, is described in the Bible, is what I would sort of think is the orthodox view that is required by the Council of Nicaea, whereas I believe in the resurrection of Jesus, but the story contains some content that should not be taken literally. I think it's being rather charitable to put that in with believing that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, because that could mean people saw visions. That they believe that their friends thought, that Jesus's friends thought he saw him resurrected. So I'm a little bit unconvinced by the wording on this one, and I think that collapsing those two categories into belief in the resurrection is being very favorable to Christians at the expense of accuracy, but I've now aired my complaint on that, so we can move on. In terms of Black English adults, the vast majority believe that Jesus was a real person and raised from the dead. And you can see here that that's 52% that they believe the resurrection as described word for word in the Bible. They do these word clouds, and while I do qualitative research, I don't really find this kind of stuff very helpful, mostly because there's not a lot of difference between the words that non-Christians and Christians said. So although it's, I guess, filling up a slide, I don't see there's an obvious message to be taken away here in terms of how people use words to denote what they think about religion. It seems very similar to me. So generally, Jesus has some good favorables. If we want to talk about it in terms of politics, he as a person isn't, as a historical figure or a character or, the center of Christianity. He's generally not, he doesn't offend people. It's the followers more who offend people than Jesus. Now we've moved on to the bit where they're going to discuss non-Christians' perceptions of Christians. And, wow, here's a real shock headline. Most English non-Christians say they know a Christian. And most of these relationships are with either their families or their friends. More than about 75% cite those relationships as being one with a person they know is a Christian. English non-Christians attribute more positive than negative qualities to the Christians they know, which is nice. They didn't, of course, say what English Christians thought of English non-Christians, so we don't know if the Christians think nice things about non-believers, but here we have non-believers saying nice things about the people, their family and friends who are Christians that they know. I personally don't find this question very insightful, given the fact that most of these relationships are moderated through family or friend relationships. So obviously you're going to be saying nice things about your friends. The fact that they're Christian might just be incidental. English non-Christians attribute more positive than negative qualities to the Christians they know. Again, if you're friends with somebody or they're in your family, chances are you're going to have a much better opinion of them than some kind of random preacher you see in a headline. Now they're reviewing the non-Christian experience with evangelism in the UK. More than half English non-Christians who know a Christian have had a conversation with them about Jesus. So there's a weird chart here on the side that I'm not entirely sure how to interpret. The way that it reads is percentage among English non-Christians who had a conversation with a Christian about their faith. I assume they mean the Christian's faith. But I don't know how to interpret this. Felt glad that I did not share their faith. Does that mean that the English non-Christian came away from the conversation feeling glad that they weren't a Christian? I think that's what that means. This 42% said, and then you've got felt sad that I did not share their faith, which was only 16% of non-Christians. And then 42% of people were honest, like, I didn't really have an opinion on Jesus and all that kind of stuff. So this is, again, I'm not sure why they pulled out this little bit, but what it really looks like is that people are happy to not be Christians. That's what it reads to me. When Christians talk about their faith in Jesus, 1 in 5 of English non-Christians they talk to are open to an experience or counter with Jesus, but more than almost 60% don't want to know. No, don't be a God botherer. Not bothered. I've got to get on the bus. Goodbye. So that's a very small, I think, percentage of people who actually are like, yeah, I want to hear more. Nearly a third of 18 to 34-year-olds non-Christians feel more positive about Jesus after speaking to a Christian about their faith in Jesus. But what they don't mention here is that, and we'll see this in terms of the few slides later, a lot of these conversations seem to be in the context of family or friendship. So this isn't a stranger coming up to you and trying to sell you Jesus. This is somebody you already know talking to you about Jesus, and obviously then you're more open to it because you like that person, whether or not you're going to convert. So again, the data, I have some questions about it, but it is what it is. Now, if you think back to that really small percentage of people who are actually practicing Christians, they report feeling a responsibility to evangelize and believe that talking to non-Christians is part of their Christian responsibility. And from here you can see on the left-hand side, have a responsibility to evangelize. This is among English practicing Christians. Almost 45% say they strongly agree and 40% tend to agree. Talking to non-Christians about Jesus is evangelism. 41% agree and 35% agree. I don't know if talking to non-Christians about Jesus is evangelism. Is that their perception of what evangelism is? They're trying to understand if people understand the concept. Sometimes it's hard to interpret other people's slides when you don't know what they were thinking. Oh, and here again, we have the slide down here, a little note, ethnic minority English adults are more likely to believe they have a responsibility to evangelize. 92% strongly plus 10 to agree, which is the whole group here is at 45 plus 40, so that's 85. Now, when you have the vast majority of self-identifying Christians out of that 53% of the whole sample that we saw, I think it was 7% that was practicing and everybody else was non-practicing. And those non-practicing Christians are not interested in evangelizing. They really don't feel like it's their job to talk to other people about Jesus. They're cultural Christians. They're not trying to get people into, actively into heaven and out there on the doorsteps, pounding on doors and trying to save souls, whether or not those souls want to be saved or not. These practicing Christians look for opportunities to slide Jesus into a conversation in order to try to convert people, and they seem to be happy to do that, like a salesperson for Amway or whatever else, Mary Kay. Non-practicing Christians, however, really don't seek out opportunities to evangelize and really don't have the confidence to talk about their faith, probably because they're not practicing and they don't want to sell stuff to people that they don't deeply believe themselves. We see here from this slide that really minuscule bit of English practicing Christians feel confident talking to non-Christians about Jesus. And that really small group of practicing Christians have talked to somebody about Jesus. And they tend to, the English practicing Christians tend to be optimistic about the impact of their evangelism. And you can see here that on the relationship with non-Christians, the percent among English practicing Christians who talked about Jesus with a non-Christian, and a quarter are talking to their friends, a quarter are talking to their acquaintances, and another 11% are talking to their family. So over that, you've got 60% of all you have to do is talk to Jesus, about, oh, I love Jesus. while you're riding with your friend to work on the bus or something, and that technically, I guess, counts. I don't necessarily think, and that of course feeds into the positive experiences that maybe non-Christians report, because they're being approached by people who are their friends or family or acquaintances, and that means that they're giving more positive experiences because they have a relationship with that person, not because they're convinced by the validity of the claims the Christians are making. This is recalling how the conversations about Jesus went, and I don't really care, mostly because it's data on people's memories of what they've done in the past is rather dodgy for lots of reasons. One, when you're casting your mind back in a survey, you might get 3 or 4 seconds to answer, and something might come to mind, and it might not be the best example or the most recent example, but it's the one you think of, because memory isn't systematic like a computer retrieval system. So a lot of these about recall questions, I generally tend to treat with a little more skepticism, depending on what time period. In the last 6 months, have you? The last 6 months is a long time to remember. In the last 24 hours is obviously a much easier thing to do. But even then, do I remember what I had for breakfast 24 hours ago? It's probably, I don't know. Right, moving on. Non-Christian responses to the conversation. I'm just going to move on here. And as this slide shows, English practicing Christians have been most active in sharing their faith with friends and family. And if that pattern holds, that would explain why people have positive reactions to their encounters with practicing Christians. Apparently, younger people feel more or do more in terms of activity. It's that youth, that's enthusiasm, that political campaigns and others gather up, like, oh yeah, when you're young and idealistic, go out and recruit for the church. Yeah, go work, that's great. Now this is talking about how people led to conversions, and you can see that most people weren't converted. 41% of UK practicing Christians grew up in a Christian family. Others they were led to their faith by attending a church service. Some report being reading the Bible, and I would imagine that this is not just a one or the other. You probably are able to tick quite a lot of these. I'm not entirely sure, but I think when you add up these totals, it's not 100%. So I would imagine that this is in more of an open-ended tick all that apply response. And most English practicing Christians attribute their faith to growing up in a Christian home. 93% of English practicing Christians have been a Christian for 11 years or more. As the number of households of practicing Christians decline, we would therefore expect even fewer practicing Christians, because there will be less households to grow up in those practices for you to repeat in your adult life. So that downward trend in terms of religiosity for the UK doesn't seem to have anything stopping its downward slope. Right, I think this is another very similar slide on conversion. Growing up in a Christian home becomes more important for English non-practicing Christians. If you are non-practicing, you're probably only, looks like 73%, 75% almost, are really only identifying as Christians because they grew up in a house where they maybe went to church every once in a while, or got married in the Christian church, or had funerals, or celebrated Christmas. These are people who are probably culturally Christian, not religiously Christian. And that's why being in the family setting is what determines their religiosity. They're socially Christian, not personal in their private beliefs. And most Christians credit their friends for introducing them to Jesus. Yes, we saw Christians who are practicing are feeling comfortable with talking to friends and acquaintances and their family members. So yeah, that makes sense. This is all just describing the same phenomenon. There's something here that I do think is interesting, that the practicing Christians are more likely to have been brought to the faith by someone younger than themselves. And they don't really unpack this. Is this, their children maybe bringing, having, I'm not sure why would it be somebody younger. this is a rather mysterious chart to me, but that is a pattern, at least that they see in the data. And then there's an inverse pattern where English non-practicing Christians are more likely to have been brought to the faith by someone older or about someone the same age. I can't really tell you, without knowing more about the data, anything about these relationships. I'm not entirely sure why they're focusing on the age of the person, and I'm not entirely sure how reliable somebody else's memory of somebody else's age at the time is. So there's a lot of questions about these, but if it does hold that, there is a relationship with younger people recruiting people to the church, I would be interested to know why and what that means exactly. Right, again, they're trying to say, oh yes, talking to Jesus, it's all very positive, and very nice to do. I felt comfortable, I didn't feel uncomfortable. But then again, if you've ever been to a Church of England situation, it's not high pressure. People aren't shaking and speaking in tongues and falling to the ground and doing other kinds of radical things that a lot of American churches and other kinds of intense churches do. Right, so let's stop sharing now, because that's the end of the slides. And I wish it was more inferential. I wish they had done some testing of causality. I wish they had added some questions in the question wording in there, as well as the response options and the charts. But in terms of the patterns, I think it's very interesting to go deeper into these numbers and to look at these categories of practicing and non-practicing. And their idea of a practicing Christian is one way to operationalize the concept. I'm not entirely sure if they said that they had to read the Bible and go to church once a month and pray, or is it one of those three or two of the three? There are other ways that you could measure Christianity in theory, but it seems, well, it kind of measures it. For the purposes of this study, it's clear what the differences are between the practicing Christians and non-practicing Christians. And I like that a lot about the study, because we, as social scientists, at least as political scientists, we tend to deal with religiosity as very homogeneous. Like, here you've got the C of E, and that's just the category. Whether or not they're cultural Christians or deeply faithful people kind of doesn't matter. They're just, if it's C of E is 1 and Roman Catholic is 2, and you're a 1, you're a 1. If you're going to church every week, you're a 1. If you're going to church, once a year, you're a 1. Unless you start to get into those questions about religiosity and church attendance and beliefs. So having these categories, opening this up a little bit, I think is very useful. It's moving in the right direction. I know as a social scientist, I want to see more conceptual work done on the atheist, on the non-belief, on the spiritual but not religious side of the question, because that's really not, talk about an even more ambiguous category. The nuns, the not religiously affiliated, are potentially all kinds of individuals, and the surveys really do need to be sharpened up as instruments to more theoretically engage with the possibilities of how people can identify in terms of their moral codes, what it means to be non-religious in that way, like what, and we technically, like humanism, free thought, do we start to look at just like philosophical outlooks, or do we look at categories of non-belief? And I think these are important questions to have and to unpack, and for social scientists to get in there and really start testing to better understand the difference, if there is one, between an agnostic and an agnostic atheist, or someone who identifies as an agnostic humanist, whereas someone who identifies as an atheistic humanist. These are way more complicated than just saying, oh, here's the church I go to. And they really deserve their own theoretical development, operationalization, and testing with pilot questions and feedback evaluations, and then really testing those measures and surveys over time. So that was your stats for November. I don't know if I'm going to have any more fun slides that I've just found on the internet randomly, but I hope you enjoyed that, learned a little something. And if you guys ever see something similar, those PowerPoints that just have reports on it with information, and you're like, I don't know what this means, but maybe Kristi can interpret it. Yeah, drop me a line and a message, although I don't really check my YouTube messages all that frequently. About once a week I check my messages, which is different from the comments. So maybe leave me a comment saying that you have something for me, and I'll try to get to it and do an interpretation on the fly as best I can. And I really, I enjoy doing this. So thanks for sticking around and being a nerd with me. I've been Kristi. You've been awesome, and until the next time we see each other, bye.